It's a couple years ago, it's the summer, I'm in Vermont, and I'm at a farmer's market. And I come across one of my absolute favorite foods, and that's kimchi. So there's something about kimchi that just violates my Jewish upbringing. I was brought up, cabbage was this like floppy, gross mess. It barely counted as a vegetable. But you ferment it, you make it spicy, and I love it. So I buy a jar and I eat it over the next couple of days. And I am just rejoicing in its spiciness. Yeah, until I'm not. I got so unbelievably sick from this kimchi. I was vomiting for days. I lost about 15 pounds. I'm not a big guy. Absolutely unbelievably sick. And I drive past where the farmer's market was a couple of weeks later, and my palms are all sweating against the steering wheel. And I go to my favorite restaurant in Providence, and we have decent Korean food in Providence, and I can't even look at the stuff without getting sick, and just feeling absolutely gross. And so you all have just seen what's happened, and I've unfortunately experienced, right? And I've been conditioned, right? So I'm now Pavlov's dog. Right? So the location, the smell, the taste, all of this stuff, these are my newly conditioned stimuli, right? And we think a lot about conditioning in psychiatry, right? Because for our patients, it's not about kimchi, right? It's about things that are much more real. And over the last couple of years, I've been working at the VA. I've been working with veterans who suffer from their conditioning. From PTSD and from things that happened, let's say, in Iraq or Afghanistan. And I'm going to give you a little bit of a taste of some of the things that they've been through. And full warning, this video is a little intense, not too terrible, but is a small piece of what some of them have gone through. So that was an IED explosion, improvised explosive device. And what I do is when these veterans come home is they're trying to drive down the highway or otherwise, and they're always scanning for that IED. They're ready for that explosion, and they're ready to go. And they have been profoundly conditioned, right, by that experience. And so our job, right, is to try to figure out how we can help that. And we've got some techniques we can do right now, right? We have cognitive processing therapy, we've got various fear extinction paradigms, and that's great, except they don't work as well as we need them to work. So cognitive processing therapy working at about 50% of individuals, fear extinction paradigms working well, let's say in a laboratory, but don't necessarily generalize to the larger world. And so what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna walk you through a little bit about some new treatments that we're developing at Brown. And how we've gone about doing it. But even before we get there, what we first need to do is we need to frame this problem from a neuroscience perspective. And so one of the core problems in PTSD, right, is inadequate prefrontal control of amygdala activity, if you will, or fear. And in these veterans with PTSD, these prefrontal areas are not working sufficiently. So what we gotta do, what our job is to do, is to help that part of the brain to work better. And so how are we going to do that? So we're going to use something called transcranial current stimulation. And I'll walk you through what this is. So we take an individual, and we take a very small power source, typically 2 milliamps, roughly what you can get out of a standard 9-volt battery. To that power source, we connect an anode. That's where the electricity goes from the power source into the brain. And then we connect a cathode, which is where the electricity comes out of the brain. And essentially what we've done now is we've created a circuit that can deliver just a tiny little bit of electricity into someone's brain. And then the question is, how can a little bit of electricity actually do anything? And I'll walk you through that. And the first thing I want you to imagine is that there's going to be a variety of different neurons that we're thinking about here, again, back in that prefrontal cortex. So we're going to have some quiet neurons. They're going to be hanging out. And on this figure, that dashed line is threshold, where this neuron would have to go in order for it to fire. So it's just kind of hanging, these quiet neurons are hanging out in the background, not doing a whole lot. And then we've got other neurons that are sort of going, but not quite. And you can imagine these are the ones in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex that are not doing anything in the context of looking for that IED. And the neat thing about a little bit of electricity is that if you give it to those quiet neurons, nothing's going to happen. On the other hand, right, you give it to the neurons that are almost ready to fire. You give those neurons a little nudge, right, and you can help them to go. And what you've done now, right, is we've helped these neurons to fire in a way that they wouldn't otherwise. So this is plasticity, right? This is learning. So the next question is, so how are we going to get this little bit of electricity where we want it to go? And so for that, what we're going to do is we're going to use a variety of mathematical models, and we're going to figure out where to put that anode and that cathode, where we're going to put that on the brain so that the electricity goes where we want it to go. And I'll show you what that looks like. So this is a charge density map where the warm or hotter colors are where there's larger concentrations of electricity, and the cooler colors are where there's less. And what you can see here is that based on figuring out where we're going to put that anode and cathode, I can get electricity into that part of the brain that I want to modulate. So that's half the story, right? So we started this talk talking about conditioning, right? Talking about environment. And so what about that? And so our challenge is to get people where they're not, right? Because sometimes it's not necessarily safe to go back to where they want to go, to say a battlefield, or we just simply can't get people there. But we can get people, right, where they're not. And we can use something called virtual reality, right? We've got some tools to put people where they otherwise aren't. And what I'm going to do next, I'm going to show you what this looks like from a veteran's perspective. I've slowed this down tremendously, just so that you can have an idea of what's going on. And then I'll talk further afterwards. So you can imagine putting the headset on and so you can imagine as if you're out on patrol and the vehicle in front of you has just hit landmine, IED, otherwise. And so this is what's going on from the veteran's perspective. The laboratory, of course, looks a little bit different, right? So we have an individual who's controlling this VR system, and then we usually have, in this case, demonstrated by some poor schmuck, who we have another person who's wearing a highly complicated virtual reality rig where we've integrated stimulation electrodes, that anode and cathode I was talking about earlier. And just as an aside, by the way, don't do this at home. So we have spent the last couple of years making sure that when you put this whole thing on and turn on, it will otherwise melt. So don't do this at home. That said, so as we go through, and so the experience in the virtual reality can be measured. And here what we're going to be doing is we're measuring something called skin conductance reactivity, right? That's my sweaty palms, right? And each of these little spikes that you see up here corresponds to some small arrows up top, and that's where there's events in the virtual reality environment. That's where there's explosions, someone shooting at you, whatever. And you can see this spiking activity as we go through. Now, you give an individual a series of these virtual reality and stimulation experiences, and it looks something like this afterwards. You can see much more attenuated. People are still reacting, but much less attenuated, or much more attenuated, I should say. And the really cool thing about this, by the way, is that this only happens when we give people real electricity and not sham. So what we've done, right, is we've tried to take the best aspects of neuroscience, right? We've tried to take some neuromodulation and combining it with all the things that we know, this richness of information from the psychotherapy and exposure world, and combine them using some fairly new and innovative tools. And maybe, to develop some wonderful new treatments for veterans with PTSD. But there's much more that we can do with this. And maybe, if I'm lucky enough, it'll even work for me and my kimchi. You can't, for those of you in the back, that's me going, yes, in the background. All right. So thank you for your attention.